Hello and welcome to our webinar on building AI trust in your organisation. I'm Liam Sapsard and I'm here with Bjorn, our Chief Data Scientist from 2021 AI, and we'll be walking you through our presentation on AI risk management and giving you some ideas on how you could actually implement this and update your existing GRC systems. So, could I just ask if everyone can hear okay? And we'll just go to the next slide. Brilliant, thank you. So what we'll be covering today's session is an introduction into AI GRC. So is this needed? And also, what are the motivations for GRC for AI models? And do you have to update your existing risk management framework? Are you able to cope with the growing number of AI models? All of this is things that we'll be addressing and looking at the existing enterprise risk management systems and how can you actually adapt these. Then taking a little look also at ChatGPT, generative AI, the growth of this and the adoption across the enterprise. How can you cope with this in a responsible manner while utilising this new technology? We'll be presenting our solution in this at the end, just as a finishing touch, and then go into a live Q&A. Next slide. So, why is GRC needed? So if you think about what GRC was actually built for and taking the examples also for AI risk management within a financial institution, all of this has to now be adapted to AI as well. So you're taking across a traditional business function and then adapting these frameworks for responsible AI adoption at scale. Then there's also, with the growth of AI, this has meant that there's also a growth of risks, many different risks like bias, but also model performance and the complex nature of different AI models as well. Is the education high enough? Are the controls prevalent enough as well to manage all these risks? And then on top of this, you also have AI models that are not your own, but you're leveraging to third-party models. How are you addressing the ethical issues that are there, or the ethical risks, or any risks that are apparent, and actually applying your policies and frameworks to this so that you can use them at scale and not just do a complete policy ban on this. On top of this, you also have the global regulations. So this could be the likes of the EU AI Act coming in, but then also internal policies as well, and other guidelines and frameworks like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. How can you take these and ensure that you are compliant, that you are utilising this framework in the best way? And obviously there's also the regulators and the pressure that is being pushed down onto traditional model risk management functions, where they go, well, now we have to actually change our approach to ensure that these new models that we're now owning are actually working in the right way and compliant to your internal policies and so on. So moving on, just a lag on the screen there. One more time. There we go. So what are the motivations for the GRC for AI models? So as we said, there's increased expectations from model risk managers, and this is not just within financial services firm, but this is anyone working with AI from a risk perspective in any organization now. So you could traditionally think it's for within the financial services sector, but now if you're working with AI, you now need to think about, okay, does my business need an AI risk management function? What are the risk controls here? What is our risk appetite when working with AI? And then also these new technical concerns that are coming out around machine learning models. And then the in-depth regulatory scrutiny that each of these teams, data scientists, model validators, are going to come under, where they have to take this information and compile it in a way that is suitable for the regulators. And with the diverse amount of use cases and the increase in the pace that validation needs to happen, these are all things that have to adapt a traditional team into something which is far more future-proof, that can also have the skill set and the technology to essentially become more enterprise-wide. And then also there is this large risk, which we're going to go into, about the third-party models. And where is the liability? Who has the issues? Who has the control? What about the data? Where's it going? All of these things you have to address before you use it, not after. Otherwise, you're really running the risk of a lot of problems there. And then finally, just on the point of machine learning models, now being utilised in all different departments. So it's not just in, let's say, underwriting or maybe even marketing. It's now every part of an organisation can now start to leverage these models, but do they have the expertise and the controls in place to manage them? I'll let Bjorn now go into a bit more detail on this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liam. See if the slide is jumping. Yeah. So now looking a bit deeper into that, so everyone on the call, probably if you work in a large organization, you are familiar with the term ERM, or enterprise risk management. And the question I would like to address in the next couple of minutes is what you should do in order to work with your existing ERM or model risk management, and the question whether this is good enough when we come to AI and machine learning. So those of you who have joined us in other kind of webinars, you probably remember that slide here where I was probably a year back or something like that, was talking about the fact that it's not only about governing the model, but it's actually also about governing the data and the system around that. So one needs to be able to both figure out whether the data has bias, whether the data is clean, as well as obviously that the model is not biased and there is a right fit, and that you have in the system around that certain access controls, segregation of duties, and so forth. So building on top of that, now we'll basically ask the question, can we actually use established systems to do this? In our daily work, we'll meet a couple of organizations that once in a while say, okay, we have some model risk management in place, yeah, and we would like to leverage that in order to work with AI models. And what I would like to point out here is that there are certain risks or certain areas to focus on when we talk about AI or machine learning related risk management that is usually not so easy to cater for when we look at traditional systems that are out there. So the first one that I'd like to address is model risk monitoring. So machine learning models compared to other more traditional statistical models, they are retrained way more often than what has been usually the case. So that means also that we more frequently need to monitor whether they are living up to the standards we'll set out. So, for example, having the right fit, having the right accuracy, things like that. There will be some additional requirements like model reportings that needs to be done. So, and model registrations. So we have way more models. It's not only one department that is actually concerned with building, let's say, credit models. Now, in this case, it's usually the whole organization. It's departments that have typically not been in this kind of governance workflow. So that could be marketing, that could be sales that leverage AI models. So having a model registry centrally is also a prerequisite for this. And then we have global regulations, as Liam pointed out, a lot of frameworks coming out by national regulators, by global regulators, new frameworks, probably even internal policies that one needs to handle and adapt to. Now, with talking about this, what we typically see in model risk management or AI model risk management is two different focus areas. The first one here in the upper left box concerns more the compliance-related tasks. So this would be typically, if we look on the regulations, certain assessments that need to be filled out. This is typically related to what we see in organizations like banks related to model risk management. And then we have what we would call model and data validation. So more the technical side of it concerning biases, concerning fit, and computing all these kind of statistics around it. and that is typically much closer to the MLOps functionality of things. Now, these two worlds speak typically quite different languages, where the first one is more legally focused and the other one is typically more technical statistics heavy focused. What we see as a need is that you need to be able to bring both of these worlds together. So you should have a consolidated risk registry of all the risk you need to cover. You need to be able to condense the monitoring, both from a compliance perspective as well as from a model validation perspective. And you need to be able to not only monitor it, but also inform leaders, inform auditors about this in a condensed way. And that's not going to be only on a model by model base, which is very operative, but also on a more strategic model portfolio perspective in order to really oversee everything. Now the question is, which role does regulations play in this? As you can see on the very bottom, regulations are then basically instrumenting this framework to tick on certain boxes. So depending on whether you want to be compliant with the UAI Act or the ICO guidelines, you would be focusing more on one of these boxes, and you would adapt this depending on what kind of region you're actually operating in. So closing the risk management gap in enterprise risk management. So the way we see it is that we'll typically have some enterprise risk management software already in most of the large organizations. And on the other hand, we have AI models operated in various types of departments in that organization. Squeezing in between a GRC system for AI would allow us to manage the regulations, manage requirements, and capture all the necessary information that can be later on transferred into the ERM system, and with that inform all the established general workflows around risk management. So in a sense, you could say that this is more like a microscope that helps someone doing model risk management or enterprise risk management and zoom in on the AI models and cater for that. But it's not the aim to build a separate structure that is completely decoupled from everything else. Now, with talking about all of these, a future proof or a proof on whether this is very well suited for the future would be to say, okay, this is probably going to work with established frameworks like traditional machine learning, credit models, recommender models, things like that. But what about new technologies? What about developments in the world of AI, machine learning that one have not really foreseen coming that far? And one example of that is generative AI. So probably everyone has heard about that term, has probably used ChatGPT and things like that. And with that comes a lot of possibilities, but probably also some risk. And with that, I would like to hand over back to Liam.
Cheers, Bill. Thank you. So thinking also about ChatGPT and how it's been used in the enterprise. So organizations, some of the large banks have put a ban on this or limited use, and even countries have done this. And it was actually just recently found as well in a study earlier this year that organizations with approximately 100,000 people each week were leaking 200 pieces of sensitive or confidential information, and that's simply not acceptable. So, and if we think about some of the reports and what's happened in the news as well around this, so just next slide. There we go. So organizations, so Samsung for instance, okay, it's leaking information. This is critical source code, but this could be happening in your organization if you do not understand what is being put in, what are the prompts, where is this information going, and how frequently is it happening. And policy simply isn't enough. You need to be able to actually see this from a technical perspective and track everything and monitor this, because you simply cannot just trust that the whole organization is going to use this in a responsible and ethical way without the right guidelines and frameworks to support this. So they did some of the work for us, OpenAI, in listing the risks that you should be aware of. And really, it's on you now to actually go, well, how are we going to address this? How are we going to decrease the bias? How are we going to ensure that the information is not disinformation, and have a solution for the privacy around this, so the privacy of your customers' data that may be getting sent there. So you need to consider all of this before actually utilising the tool, and especially if you're utilising it in the corporate environment. Back to you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. So the question now is, as I mentioned before, if we would say that the framework I was suggesting before is actually suitable for the future and is not a one-off suggestion, but something that can sustainably be utilized to govern machine learning models in various types of forms, or AI models for that sense, then we should be able to show you an example of how to do that with actually this type of model, which is generative AI. And to do that, what we will propose in order to address all the risks listed by not only OpenAI, but also a lot of other institutions around the world, a lot of firms being concerned about that, put out their thoughts. So our answer would be to first of all start with a conformity assessment about the actual usage of that model. So if we have users confirming that they will use the model only in certain ways, then we basically have the first building block in getting their consent to something, which means that once we will detect that they are not doing that, we have the right to take certain actions. The second building block in this will be a real-time monitoring of what actually people do with the LLM. And with the LLM, I'm very generic here, because that could be obviously the ChatGPT in the beginning, but there could be probably also large language models that are running on site of a large institution, which is not hosted by other third parties. On that monitoring, it would allow probably to do certain sentiments on the generated information. It will allow to do real-time monitoring, detecting of PII data or other kind of risky entities that can be then removed and not sent to any kind of API. Let that be an OpenAI, a ChatGPT API, or another kind of API of an LLM running in your own data center. And then storing all this information will deliver a digital proof on how the system has actually been used. And that could help to actually detect whether there are certain misalignments between the actual conformity assessment from beginning and the actual use. Now, based on that, the system that it would be suitable should be able to establish controls and risk guardrails around that large language model, where, for example, certain platform capabilities, assigning rules or things like that. Now, how that can look in an active demo environment, this is what we're going to show you in the next video clips. So here what you see is an interaction with the ChatGPT API. Now, what I put in here as a user is some information that I will definitely not like to be shared with any other third party, and I would not like this to be used by an LLM. For example, a name and an email address. In this case, it will be detected and replaced, meaning that the content, the secretive content, is not actually used by the model or shared by any other third-party service. On the other side, using this kind of detection and logging elements of it would allow to actually go back in time and actually see how both the system is used, but also with what it is used. So what kind of questions are addressed, what was detected, what was generated by a model over time, and this would allow to establish controls and guardrails around that. So one could imagine that if the generated output has a political meaning or some sort of bias, that would be flagged. And if it has too much PII information, it will be marked as not usable or something like that. And with this, one can set up workflows related to the actual usage.
Fantastic. So now thinking about what's the next steps. So we have guides on this. We have the solution ready, and we're really ensuring organizations that they can work with these large language models in a trustworthy way at scale, so you don't have to ban it, and then continuing to develop and ensure that it meets the regulations that are required. So we have guides out there available now, and you can also get in touch for a demo, and we can help you understand how to get started. So please feel free to reach out to myself or Bjorn, and we can take the conversation further. We'll move on to questions now. So.
Yeah, there's one question. What is the future of the governance of large language models? I'll assume I'll take that.
Yeah, you go for
it. So the way we see it for now, on the first step is basically to be able to use whatever models people are using these days. Let's say ChatGPT being the most prominent one, to allow people to use this in a most secure way. It will probably not really be perfect. Over time, I personally think that larger organizations will start building their own systems, so they will base their own chat services around open source versions of these models. I mean, we're now a couple of months into the whole history of all these LLMs, and we're already seeing quite good open source alternatives to the ChatGPT hosted versions. Now, if one has the capabilities in-house to do that, that will allow a lot of different things, for example, retrained models, context-specific setups with the models and things like that. And having some usability or some monitoring around that will definitely help to govern that also in that case.
We have two more questions as well, one from Yannick. So, is your tool working only when LLMs are used through API, not directly in the open tool, such as OpenChat?
Yeah, so currently the setup is through the API. We are not, so the next thing we'll see, obviously, with using open source tools, that will be when the tool is hosted on site, but that might be also through an API indirectly. Regarding this open tool, like the chat interface, we don't have a solution right now for that. We're working on that, figuring out what is the right way to do that, but that might be in the next round for this.
And next one, Tom. So the EU has not yet published how LLMs will be regulated in the EU AI Act. How does your system allow for flexibility in governance where the regulations are evolving quickly?
Yeah. So the whole setup, basically, as I mentioned in the framework, the regulations are just instrumenting and ticking on the boxes on this framework. So that means that once we have a more adapted regulation around the LLMs, and I'm sure that once the EU AI Act will be really put into a hard law, then this might be some, or have some adjustments for this. Then the system can be very flexibly be adapted. For some of the regulations, we're screening the market, meaning we're also delivering updates on the regulations within the systems. And for others, we're offering that as an additional service, or even allow customers to do it themselves. And in that sense, the system is relatively flexible.
Okay. And then we have two more from Yannick. So yeah, thanks for all the questions. So the UX is rebuilt to make it corporately safe.
Yeah, so we went through a rebuild of that, just so we are basically delivering a front end for this. The intelligence is not necessarily so much in the front end. We just try to orient it ourselves so it looks as close to ChatGPT and experience as possible. In the end, it's more, if you want, an API with some detection steps and monitoring steps underneath. So we could actually also deliver just the API to that, so that if organizations would like to embed this API into their own environments into their own front ends. That's also possible. So this UX or the UI to this is more like for demo setup, but can be obviously also used by end users.
Yeah, and there can be also elements of customization as well for specific corporate settings as well, and also various different thresholds depending on the amount of PII or elements that you would like to detect and report on.
Of course.
Other question as well, does it work in all language? As a lot of chats are not in English.
Yeah, so in this case, it's working with all the languages. So we tested it on English, Danish, on German. So it's both you could say the general chat interface, which is this demo case based on OpenAI. OpenAI's models is working with all languages, as well as the entity recognition and the PI data recognition is also language neutral. Obviously, there are certain languages that it is a bit better on, more the larger languages. But in general, it's working with most of the known language. For Chinese, for example, I haven't tried it, so that's maybe
added to the list.
Added to a list, exactly, right? But generally, it is working with other languages as well. Yeah.
But we've actually got clients utilising this at the moment, and obviously, as we're trying to keep up as well with the developments in the market. So there's the element of R&D, and then working closely with the regulators, with our customers, and also just being on the ball when it comes to about how can we ensure that it's being utilised in a safe way. But all of this we'd like to just, take the opportunity to follow up with as well afterwards. And if you do have any specific questions or requirements or curiosities, feel free to reach out, and then we can continue from there. But if there are no other questions, then we can wrap up, and thank you all for joining, and hope to hear from you soon.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.